Hey guys, it's Mr. Drake. We are going to continue on with our unit on imperialism, and today we're going to be looking at a country that did not actually get imperialized, but did modernize as a result of outside influence, and eventually became an imperial power in itself, that being Japan. So by the time we're done here, you should be able to explain how American influence helped lead to this era of modernization and industrialization in Japan. Be able to describe the reforms of a major period of modernization in Japan known as the Meiji Restoration, and describe the effect of the Meiji Restoration on Japan more long term. So, also be able to identify or define Commodore Perry, the Meiji Restoration itself, diet, don't ever pronounce that diet, don't let me hear you saying that, and zaibatsu. So, we've talked about Japan in this class before, and we've talked about the feudal system in place in Japan, with the shogunate being the primary leader that had the power, and then the daimyo and the samurai warriors and all that. And Japan held on to that longer than almost any other country we're going to talk about. Whereas in Europe, feudalism had completely died off by, the 1400s for them in many places. Japan continued to keep that very rigid, old school style social class in place. And that things began to change in the mid-1800s. In 1853, Americans made contact, formal diplomatic contact with Japan, really for the first time. And an American navalman named Commodore Matthew Perry sails a fleet of ships into Tokyo Bay, lands and demands that Japan open up its ports to trade with America, because America wanted some Japanese goods and wanted that market to sell their goods as America had begun to industrialize. Eventually, Japan agrees to this. They end up signing a very unequal treaty in which Americans are given extraordinary civil rights within Japan and trading rights that really favored them at the expense of the Japanese. Well, over time, this is going to make the Japanese very angry that they were sort of exploited like this by America. And in 1867, they overthrow the shogunate and end that feudal system, really, in Japan. And who ends up coming to power was a 15-year-old named Emperor Meiji, whose picture you see there on the right, wearing an awesome hat. So it was at this time that Japan begins to westernize. They travel to Europe and to America, government officials do, and they see how those governments are set up and how their economies actually function. And they decide to take all that they learned and adapt it for Japan and essentially beat the Europeans and the Americans at their own game. And their goal is to become a power in the mold of one of those Western countries. So in the government, they issue a constitution, which they had never had before, and it establishes equality of all citizens before the law. This does not mean equality of all people in terms of social standing. It does away with some of the really rigid class systems that were in place with feudalism, but women still don't have equal rights in government or having a say in the economy and all of that. It does put in place a legislature, the Diet. The Diet consists of two houses or two bodies. One of them has representatives that are voted on by the people, and then one has members that are voted on by not voted on, but appointed by the emperor. It also abolishes special privilege for the samurai, as they had held particularly high standing in feudal Japan. In terms of the economy, you see the government invest in new technology like railroads and telegraphs and a new banking system, things that are going to bring Japan up to speed because they have been so isolated for so long, primarily because of their geography, but also because they believe very strongly in their traditional way of life. The government decides to industrialize by starting up industries. They invested tons of money in getting industries going that manufactured all kinds of goods. And then they would sell off those industries to these really wealthy families who would end up building them up even further. And those families and those big industries were known as zaibatsu. Sometimes it's called the zaibatsu system or zaibatsu economy. But some of the famous zaibatsu you've heard of in American culture. And they started off as these big Japanese companies all the way back in the 1800s in some cases. Companies like Nissan and Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, those all started off as zaibatsu during the Meiji Restoration and the period shortly after. So, the Meiji Restoration leads to a rapid industrialization of Japan. They have a very strong sense of nationalism, patriotism, identity. They have this strong sense of community, really, in Japan because it's such a homogeneous country where everyone has the same ethnic background. There's no real internal divisions. So, using that strong sense of nationalism and strong government investment, Japan industrializes much faster than a lot of the Western countries. It took places like America and England, in some cases like 100 years to fully industrialize. Japan is behind by decades by the time they actually started industrializing in the 1870s, and they catch up in a matter of about 30 or 40 years. So they get it done really, really, really fast. And as that industrialization happens, the demand for resources goes way up, just like in every other industrializing country, where you have to have the natural resources. And that's eventually going to lead to Japan itself becoming an imperial power. And I have down here at the bottom of this slide some charts that show you just how quickly and amazingly rapidly the Japanese actually industrialized. So take a look at those numbers there. Obviously, you don't need to know any of those numbers. Those are just some charts that I shamelessly stole from Wikipedia to illustrate my point. So that will do it. Be ready for a quiz on this, and we will be looking at China later on in this unit and look at how they, as a fellow Asian nation along with Japan, reacted to Western influence. As always, ask your teachers if you have any questions. Cheers.